That's right. The hearing on information policy, the Census, and National Archives will come to order. Good afternoon, and the subcommittee on government reform will now come to order, and without objection, the chair and ranking minority member will have 5 minutes to make opening statements, followed by opening statements not to exceed 3 minutes by any other member who seeks recognition. Without objection, members and witnesses may have 5 legislative days to submit a written statement or extraneous materials for the record. Welcome to today's oversight hearing on stakeholders' views on issues for the National Archives and Records Administration. The purpose of today's hearing is to examine issues that President Obama's administration should consider in selecting the next Archivist of the United States of America. We will consider several important topics, including NARA's strategical plan, the Freedom of Information Act, the Presidential Library Donation Act, the Office of Government Information Services Act, the collection and storage of historical records, and the staffing of NARA facilities. The National Archives and Records Administration is the nation's record keeper. Its stated mission is to serve American democracy by safeguarding and preserving the records of our government. As we will hear from our witnesses today, the next archivist must have the requisite knowledge and skills to fulfill this mission using 21st century tools. It is this subcommittee's hope that our hearing today will provide the President with some valuable information that he can use in selecting the next archivist. Before we go to our witnesses, I would like to address the recent findings of NARA's Inspector General on the loss of records. The NARA Inspector General has reported a serious security breach at the National Archives concerning certain Clinton administration documents. Chairman Towns has stated the committee's position on the matter, that the committee will do everything possible to protect the integrity of the FBI's criminal investigation while we fulfill our constitutional duty to investigate the compromised security protocols at the National Archives and work to prevent future incidents. The committee will hold briefings into this matter with NARA and the FBI so committee members can begin to understand the magnitude of the security breach and all the steps being taken to recover the lost information. It is my hope that we can work with the minority to accomplish this. Now, on to today's topic. I now yield to the distinguished ranking minority member, Mr. McHenry of North Carolina.
Well, thank you, Chairman Clay, and thank you for holding this hearing, especially in light of the recent reports we have out of the National Archives, and I appreciate your leadership in working with the minority side of the aisle as well. The National Archives is an agency with extremely important functions. We all know that. The archiving of our government's valuable records requires a methodical approach to guarantee the preservation of documents with continuing value to the American people. Some of these records contain highly sensitive information, and these records must be secured to protect national security and personally identifiable information as well. The effectiveness of the archives as protector of the records under its control is a piece of the national security puzzle. This is why I'm so troubled by the pattern of careless handling of sensitive material by the archives. This week, the Inspector General of the Archives described a potentially catastrophic loss of data to our committee's staff. The Inspector General, with the assistance of the Justice Department and the Secret Service, is currently investigating the loss of a hard drive containing 1 terabyte of data derived from records from the Clinton presidency that went missing from the Archives College Park facility. A terabyte of data is approximately equivalent to several million books. We're trying to get an exact description of how many pages of text that would be, but it's certainly hundreds of millions of pages of data. Data on drives include more than 100,000 Social Security numbers, contact information, and home addresses for various Clinton administration officials, Secret Service and White House operating procedures, event logs, social gathering logs, political records, and other highly sensitive information. The full extent of the contents of the drive is still being investigated. The IG characterized the violation as, quote, the greatest loss ever and troubling and amazing, end quote. The IG described to us an environment at the College Park facility where hundreds of employees have access to sensitive data, where janitors, visitors, interns, and others with no clearance are able to walk through areas where hard drives containing national security secrets are just lying around. In fact, Archives employees use the area where the hard drives were left out as a shortcut to the bathroom. Now, apparently, another room is too warm and they have to keep the door open for cooling purposes. A bizarre enough story. This incident should be troubling if it weren't isolated. But it's even more alarming because of its part as a larger pattern. All you have to do is read the reports released by the IG over the last few years to see that the loss of this hard drive is just the latest example of carelessness at the Archives. Archives employees were accidentally or intentionally throwing away original Bureau of Indian Affairs records so frequently that a rule was put in place that required security officers and janitors to check the trash before it was taken out. These records are irreplaceable, and they were being thrown in the trash by Archives employees and personnel. The failures of the Archives security protocols are seemingly endless. In 2007, an annual inventory identified as missing approximately 559 pieces of equipment, including items with memory storage capabilities and the potential of storing sensitive personal identifying information on them. A report published in 2006 revealed that the CIA and other federal agencies had to reclassify over 55,000 pages of records taken from the open shelves of the Archives. But we can't forget the incident in 2005 with former President Clinton advisor Sandy Berger, National Security Advisor, and he pled guilty to unlawfully removing documents from the Archives. Apparently he was stuffing them in his socks. There aren't proper protocols here. And this shouldn't be a partisan issue. Historians want access to these records to give an original account and an accurate account of American history. It's not simply a Clinton administration issue or a Bush administration issue. It's truly preserving our nation's history. Yesterday, the Partnership for Public Service and American Universities Institute for the Study of Public Policy Implementation released their report of best and worst places to work in the federal government in 2009. Unsurprisingly, the National Archives was one of the worst. It ranked 29 out of 30 overall. Now, this is unfortunate. Not only are the employees unhappy, but we're not even protecting our nation's history. In the categories of leadership, supervisors, and strategic management, the Archives ranked a paltry 22, 20, and 21, respectively. This is unfortunate. We have to change the culture in the Archives and make sure that we protect our nation's data. Acting Archivist Adrian Thomas was invited to appear here today, but she declined. Ms. Thomas decided that her presence at a ribbon-cutting ceremony was of far greater importance. Mr. Chairman, I hope that we'll be able to invite her in and have a hearing on that, or at the very least, the new archivist that the President appoints. And now, back to Ms. Thomas, her failure to grasp the gravity of the situation is shocking. She certainly has something to explain. She has a lot of explaining to do here to Congress and the American people and her employees. And there are immediate questions that she needs to be here today to answer. Has an inventory been done to determine if any other records are missing? As a very important question. And what immediate security measures have been taken to prevent further loss or theft? Given the pattern of mismanagement and carelessness at the National Archives, I look forward to working with Chairman Clay in the committee majority to schedule a hearing with Ms. Thomas as soon as possible. We have to give her the opportunity to account for the negligence within the archives and account to Congress what we must do to fulfill our obligations to future generations. We are here today to discuss the qualifications of President Obama that President Obama should be looking for in a new archivist. It's clear that a replacement for Ms. Thomas can't come fast enough. The input of professionals from the archives would be helpful, but there's not, unfortunately, a single representative from the archives here today, and that's unfortunate. I thank the witnesses for being here. You're certainly experts in the field, and we certainly appreciate that for the record and giving us guidelines going forward. Thank you, Chairman Clay, for your leadership, and thank you for your hard work on this matter and the census as well.
Thank you, Mr. McHenry, and you can be assured that the committee members will be briefed on everything that took place at NARA, as well as we will eventually get the acting director here. Are there any other committee members that would like to make an opening statement? Ms. Watson of California, recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, for holding today's hearing to bring together various stakeholders to share their views on the issues that are of particular concern as the Obama administration selects a new archivist of the United States to lead the National Archives and Records Administration. As a guardian of the historical record of the United States, it's imperative that the NARA is run effectively and innovatively to protect our nation's civic narrative for current and future generations of inquisitive Americans who seek greater understanding of who we are. Finding a new archivist who advocates for transparency, who understands and who anticipates the challenges of the NARA may face, and who possesses the expertise to implement technology which can expedite access to our nation's records, are all critical to guaranteeing the NARA is capable of protecting the integrity of our national records. The next archivist of the United States must ensure that the NARA is equipped with an effective and consistent system for electronic records management. And we do hope that the Obama administration may have as its legacy an accurate record of America's policies, activities, and a bit of its history. An effective electronic record management system which can process this massive backlog, should also possess the ability to assist in the declassification of eligible federal and presidential records. With approximately 400 million pages of valuable documents frozen in a system which grows by 25 million pages per year, it is critically important that the next archivist takes a proactive approach to modernizing this system so that Americans can have timely access to the documents which bring context to our national experience. I would like all of today's witnesses, I would like to thank them for appearing before this committee, and their testimony will provide invaluable insight into the criteria the Obama administration should consider in selecting a new archivist of the United States. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Watson, for the opening statement. If there are no additional opening statements, Mr. Westmoreland has indicated to me he does not have one. The subcommittee will now receive testimony from the witnesses before us today. And I want to start by introducing our panel. Our first witness is Dr. Patrice McDermott, Director of OpenTheGovernment.org. Our next witness is Ms. Meredith Fuchs, and she's the General Counsel for the National Security Archives. And our final witness will be Mr. Lee White, Executive Director of the National Coalition on History. Welcome to all three. As a note, before we begin, two witnesses scheduled today were unable to attend. They are acting archivist Adrian Thomas and Dr. Thomas C. Battle from Howard University, who represents the Society of American Archivists. I thank all of our witnesses for appearing today and look forward to their testimonies. And it is the policy of the Oversight Committee to swear in all witnesses before they testify. Would you all please stand and raise your right hand? Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? And let the record reflect that the witnesses answered in the affirmative. You may be seated. And I ask that each of the witnesses now give a brief summary of their testimony. Please limit your summary to 5 minutes. And the little light on the desk will indicate when your 5 minutes is up. Your complete written statement will be included in the hearing record. Ms. McDermott, please begin with your opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Clay, Mr. McHenry, and members of the subcommittee for the opportunity to speak today on the issues that the Obama administration should consider in selecting the next Archivist of the United States. My name is Patrice McDermott. I'm director of OpenTheGovernment.org, a coalition of more than 70 consumer and good government groups, library associations, journalists, environmentalists, labor organizations, and others united to make the federal government a more open place in order to strengthen public trust in government, make us safer, and support our democratic principles. One of my former colleagues who recently retired from NARA said, "I believe in NARA as an ideal." I think that is where those of us on this panel and our colleagues in the public interest community stand as well. We do this because NARA is probably the only agency in the executive branch that has and is seen by the public to have access to government information as its primary mission. NARA has primarily understood its mission to encompass information that, for a variety of reasons, is historically significant. This understanding of its mission is reflected in its leadership and its staff. While the employees of NARA are dedicated civil servants and there are many talented individuals working there, the agency does have a tendency to be inward-looking and focused on the past. The perception of NARA is that it is primarily reactive, not proactive, and we know that NARA has preferred to take a collegial rather than a leadership stance with the agencies and within the government overall. The critical position of NARA in both the life cycle management of the records of our federal government and the mounting challenges the government faces in this area necessitate that the culture and stance of NARA change. NARA is increasingly being asked to take on new challenges and is looked to as a site to locate new initiatives and offices pertaining to public access to contemporaneous government information. These include the Office of Government Information Services created by the Open Government Act, and an office that will have responsibility for implementing the Memorandum on Designation and Sharing of Controlled Unclassified Information, better known as Sensitive but Unclassified Information. Moreover, NARA has another primary mission that receives an insufficient amount of the agency's attention and resources: records administration. Many of us in the Public Access Committee are deeply concerned about how NARA is addressing its responsibility for records management and provision of access to the records of our nation. This is especially true for e-records. NARA's 2006 to 2016 strategic plan is indicative of the reasons for our concerns. It has a total of 1.5 pages on records administration and one vague strategy for electronic records management, and that's accompanied by a strategy on physical record storage. Indeed, the strong and evident focus on the strategic plan is on the archives portion of NARA's mission, the first A, combined with an emphasis on civic education and exhibits. The perception, reinforced by conversations with current and former NARA staff, is that the agency increasingly understands itself as a museum. The former archivist, Dr. Weinstein, moved the agency in some good directions with the use of technology. NARA's use of technology, though, appears to be focused on, again, making NARA a museum rather than a lead agency on lifecycle management of records for public access. Recent history shows, however, that we need an archivist who has a proven record of standing up for open government. Dr. Weinstein took good positions on open government when crises arose, but did not put the agency in a leadership stance. That is an approach we can no longer afford. We need an archivist who understands NARA is not just a museum of historical documents, but is a steward responsible for securing the integrity of government records. He or she must be able to lead NARA to embrace the role of catalyst for the information revolution and enunciate clear, consistent, and practical electronic record policies. Most importantly, we need an archivist who will lead the government to meet the new challenges of managing and preserving electronic records, including emails. Records management must not be about cleaning up messes after they occur, but taking the proactive steps necessary to prevent the loss of our documentary record. The new archivist needs to be a visionary in terms of the importance and public use of government records in all forms and formats and throughout their life cycle, and so needs to have a strong familiarity with technology as a tool. She or he also needs to be someone who understands and appreciates records management, again, throughout the life cycle, not just of records that will be archived. The public and the government need an archivist who can provide vision and leadership for the federal government and foster successful partnerships with history and access professionals inside and outside government. The key qualification is his or her commitment to maintaining the record of our national government and meeting the mandates of law. Because the next archivist will have so many challenges, am I out of time?
You can
one more
wrap
page.
up.
We recommend that a second-tier political appointee be created to serve a chief of staff type position and to manage and enliven the bureaucracy at NARA. This would free the archivist to assume the needed leadership role and might attract candidates who have the vision to move the agency and to assist the president in moving forward. The new archivist and this second person should give the CUI office and the Office of Government Information Services support and independence that the Information Security Oversight Office has. For OGIS, this independence is particularly important because OGIS must also oversee NARA's own significant involvement with FOIA. In order for President Obama's Day One promises on transparency to have any meaningful impact, immediate steps must be taken to protect the integrity of government records throughout their life cycle, from creation to permanent preservation or authorized destruction. Thank you for the opportunity to speak on these important issues. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Ms. McDermott.
And
Ms. Fuchs, you may proceed.
Thank you. Chairman Clay, members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify today about the National Archives and Records Administration. I've submitted a written statement that details my organization's experience with NARA, so you'll be happy to know I'm going to only focus on a few points right now. We understand that the White House is actively currently assessing candidates for the Office of Archivist of the United States, and I'm hopeful that the members of this subcommittee will let the White House know that the next archivist must be someone who is eager to confront the challenges that are facing NARA, and should be someone who has the authority and the management skills to have a significant impact. I want to preface my remarks to say that my organization works very regularly with NARA officials, and we strongly support their mission. In the years that I've focused on information policy, NARA officials they've always taken our concerns seriously. They've always been responsive when we've called upon them. But our experience is that NARA has failed to take leadership amongst government agencies in the area where it has unique expertise and, in my view, responsibility. My written submission describes the divergence between a view of NARA primarily as a museum of the past and a view of NARA as a critical component in our government's overall information policy. From the outside, to us, NARA often seems to act like a disengaged bureaucrat, mechanically doing its work when it should be leading change. Right now, NARA has the opportunity to lead the change that President Obama has called for in his transparency directives. We believe NARA can only fulfill this mission, however, if it starts its work long before the boxes of old documents make their way to NARA's warehouses. I'm going to highlight 4 critical areas that I think will require the archivist's immediate attention. The first is electronic records management and the records lifecycle. If there's one knowledge base that the new archivist should have, it is of electronic records and records lifecycle management. NARA must solve the problem of long-term storage and preservation. And on that front, I urge this committee to inquire of NARA into the functioning of the Electronic Records Archive. But NARA also must lead the charge in getting federal agencies to learn how to manage their records. Agencies have a legal obligation to preserve records of historical significance. They must have their records disposition schedules approved by NARA, but we know of very few instances when NARA has taken strong action to enforce the law. A second issue is classified records. I believe most people at NARA would agree with me that the classified and declassified records process is inefficient, time-consuming, and ineffective. I'm not going to spend much time on it, but I would say that we strongly support the establishment of a well-funded National Declassification and Historical Records Center at NARA that will make the growing volume of currently inaccessible records available to the public. The new archivist should spearhead efforts to gain agency cooperation and advance the necessary legislative changes to make this a reality, and quickly. The third area is presidential records and presidential libraries. NARA's effectiveness at preserving presidential records is an area of grave concern. The Oversight Committee has heard over many years about mismanagement of presidential records and problems with the presidential library system. I'm not going to revisit all of those details today, but I do think that NARA at least does appear to view itself as powerless to oversee presidential record keeping. And they do this is their view even in the case of legitimate concerns that records may be missing or destroyed. It also is faced with tremendous challenges regarding the presidential library system. NARA is currently undergoing a process to assess alternative models for presidential libraries. I urge this committee to inquire of NARA on the details of its process and to ensure that they are considering all alternative models in that process. Finally, I'm going to highlight my fourth concern, which is the issue of access. And I urge the next archivist to be someone who can view access through the lens of President Obama's January 21st Open Government Memorandum. He or she should have a vision for Archives 2.0 so that they can serve a new generation of researchers. So what does this all mean for the selection of the new archivist? The person who's chosen must be someone who doesn't only care about history, but also understands what's coming in the future. They have to understand the promise of technology, and frankly, they should be someone who has some experience implementing technology for preservation and access. Moreover, they must view NARA not just as a museum of the past, but as a resource to serve the needs of our people today and in the future. Instead of looking at the new responsibilities that Congress has been placing on NARA as an interference in their mission, they should view these as opportunities to help agencies do a better job at preserving records. The next archivist also must be a skilled diplomat and a manager who can motivate and lead. I was sad to read that NARA had been listed as one of the least favorable places to work in the federal government, because most of the people I know who work there are working there because they care about the mission, and they should also have the benefit of having a good work environment. Finally, and for my organization this is most essential, the archivist must be an unwavering advocate of transparency and access. They should understand in their core that the National Archives exists to advance our democracy, and it can only do so if the government creates, preserves, and permits the public to see records of its activities and its policies. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak to you. I'll be happy to respond to questions.
Thank you, Ms. Fuchs, for your statement. Mr. White, you may make an
And I can assure you, my testimony is 5 minutes and 22 seconds. Chairman Clay and
We're keeping score.
Well, don't start now. Chairman Clay and members of the subcommittee, I am Lee White, the Executive Director of the National Coalition for History. The coalition is a consortium of over 60 organizations that advocates and educates on federal legislative and regulatory issues affecting historians, archivists, political scientists, teachers, and other public stakeholders. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss the major issues we see facing the new archivist of the United States. Let me add to your comments by saying NARA's apparent loss of Clinton-era electronic records is inexcusable. The mismanagement of these sensitive records exemplifies the urgent need for systemic change throughout the agency. It also shows why the Obama administration must move quickly to nominate a new archivist with the management skills needed to address the serious problems plaguing the agency. Here is just a brief summary of the key issues I addressed in my written testimony, and the ones most pressing we see facing the new Archivist of the United States. First, resources. Any consideration of the issues facing the National Archives must begin with a discussion of resources, both financial and human. For too long, the Congress and various administrations have given NARA additional responsibilities without a commensurate increase in funding. The top priority for the new archivist should be to address the growing processing backlog. Congress should give NARA the financial resources necessary to not only process the existing backlogs of historical materials, but also to keep up with the exponential increase of new records. With regard to human resources, NARA is facing the retirement of a large percentage of its workforce. The agency must employ and train an entire new generation of archival professionals. As everyone else has stated, I'm disappointed that the National Archives finished 29th out of 30 federal agencies in measuring employees' job satisfaction. The first challenge the new archivist will face is improving NARA's organizational culture and restoring morale at the agency. Second, the archivist should ensure the creation and preservation of federal and presidential records. The Archivist of the United States will need both the full backing of the President as well as vigilant congressional oversight to ensure that all branches of the government adhere to the legal requirements of the Federal Records and Presidential Records Act. Third, reform the presidential library system. Last fall, Congress directed NARA to prepare a report due this summer that suggests alternative models for the presidential library system. We all, I think, agree that the presidential library system is broken, and reforming the operations, maintenance, and funding of the library should be a top priority for the new archivist. Number 4, complete deployment of a new system for preserving electronic records. The long-delayed electronic records archive is an essential tool for the NARA of today and tomorrow. Mandatory use of the ERA by all federal agencies is currently scheduled to begin in January 2011. The new archivist must ensure that the ERA meets that deadline. Fifth, pursue efficient declassification and open access to public information. Overclassification of government information not only denies or delays public access to records, but also squanders resources by adding to the backlog of records that need to go through the convoluted declassification process. The archivist should play a key role within the administration in the development of the forthcoming government-wide controlled unclassified information policy. The new archivist should also advocate within the administration for the establishment of a national declassification center at NARA, which we were disappointed to see was not included in the President's fiscal year 2010 budget request. Sixth, improve citizens' access to government records. NARA must expand online access to finding aids and digitize portions of its collections, as well as maintain extended research hours so that stakeholders can access materials that are only available at NARA facilities. Seventh, expand NARA's educational and outreach activities. The records and artifacts entrusted to NARA's stewardship are truly national treasures. To improve historical and civic literacy, NARA should continue to expand its excellent educational and public programs. And finally, Mr. Chairman, this is something that is dear to your heart, the National Historical Publications and Records Commission. The History Coalition strongly supports the grants program of the NHPRC. We urge the administration and the new archivist to work with you, Chairman Clay, towards the passage of the legislation you introduced to reauthorize the NHPRC at an annual level of $20 million per year for fiscal years 2010 through 2014. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, and I will be happy to respond to any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. White. And now we will move to the question period for members under the 5-minute rule, and I will go in a different order and recognize the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Watson, 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. The Open Government Act of 2007 created the Office of Government Information Services within the NARA to review the record management procedures of agencies and to improve the application of the Freedom of Information Act by serving as an impartial mediator towards requesters and agencies. However, experts have argued that the OGIS has never been adequately funded, and Alan Weinstein, the previous archivist of the United States, contended that these responsibilities should not be the NIRA's, but within the sole jurisdiction of the Justice Department. So I ask any of you that would like to respond, if you think the Department of Justice is the appropriate agency for resolving the Freedom of Information Act disputes, and what kind of increases do you think the NARA would need to sufficiently fulfill the statutory responsibilities of the OGIS? And let me just go down the line.
Sure, I'd be happy to respond. I think that it is without question that NAR did not welcome the idea of OGIS being placed there, although I do believe that now that OGIS is going to be at NARA, they're sort of stuck with it, and I'm hopeful that they're going to take it seriously. There is no question that the Justice Department is not an appropriate place to have a mediator of FOIA disputes. We have long experience dealing with the Justice Department. They are very professional, but they defend the government, so there's an inherent conflict of interest in them playing that role. We are very concerned that it's taken so long to see the appointment of a director of the Office of Government Information Services. I understand that appointment is imminent. I think that's going to be a significant test on whether they are seriously taking the responsibility to act as that role as a mediator, because that person can make a tremendous difference in terms of the openness of government. But if the person who they hire to start up that office is not someone who comes with a vision and a desire to make a difference, well, then it's just wasted money.
Thank you. Ms. McDermott?
Yes, thank you. Excuse me. I agree completely with Meredith. I mean, the placement of the Office of Government Information Services was thought through very hard among ourselves and with people on the Hill. And while we know that NARA was not pleased to have it, partly because it was initially unfunded, we do think that that is the best place for it, and the Justice Department, for the reasons that Ms. Fuchs gave, is not it. In terms of how many resources they need, I think that's probably something that the NARA folks and the new director of the office, when he or she is hired, are best going to be placed to recommend. We are concerned, though, that enough money be allocated for the office that they are not dependent on detailees from the Justice Department, who are, good and decent civil servants, but they bring with them their Department of Justice frame of mind, and we want a new look at these cases and at these issues. I would also say that the law also asks that this office oversee or take a look anyway at how the FOIA is being implemented government-wide, and I think that's going to be a very important job. DOJ has responsibility for giving guidance, but nobody in the executive branch has responsibility for ensuring that the agencies government-wide are actually complying with the law. So we're very hopeful. I mean, we're anxious to see who is named, and we'll work with them and try to get them the necessary funding.
Thank you. And Mr. White, I have a question for you, and I'm sure you concur with what has been said previously. In one of his first acts, President Obama released a memorandum on transparency and open government and issued Executive Order 13489, which revoked President Bush's executive order of 13233, which placed limits on access to presidential records. So what would you say the record of implementation has been thus far in terms of the Obama administration applying a presumptive openness? And what other actions would you recommend the president take to increase transparency and accountability in the executive branch?
Well, I have to say that the day that the president issued that executive order was one of the happiest days of my professional life. So I've been working on it for quite a long time. I think it's too soon to tell. I know that right after the president issued the executive order, some records were released, I believe, from the Reagan Library. I think what's still needed, however, is there's legislation pending in the Senate that passed here in the House, H.R. 35, the Presidential Records Reform Act, that needs to be passed. We need to get the changes that the administration made put into law, enacted, codified, so that the Presidential Records Act is not left to the whim of any each president that comes in. Once it's codified, it's going to be harder for them to manipulate the Presidential Records Act to their own uses. So I would say getting the Senate to pass that bill and sending it back over here if there are any changes. I know that President Obama has already committed himself to signing the bill, so you need to get your colleagues on the other side of the hill to start moving.
We'll be waiting for it. I'll turn it back to you. I'll go back to you, Mr. Chairman. I
Thank
do have
you.
some other questions.
Yeah,
I'll
we'll
raise
do a
them after
second
yours.
round. Thank you, Ms. Watson. Mr. Westmore, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Fuse, you are an advocate of or against overclassification, I guess. And I know that in the past that there has been some things that were released and then later on reclassified, I guess, by the CIA or another agency. How often are documents released by the archives that are subsequently reclassified?
Well, a couple of years ago, there was a very significant incident that my organization played a role in uncovering, where there was significant reclassification going on at the National Archives. As a result of that, an audit was done, and it was found that most of those reclassifications were either inappropriate or, even if technically legitimate under the executive order, were questionable. So there had been a lot of unnecessary reclassification, but there was certainly some core that was properly, apparently, reclassified. My understanding is since that time, new procedures were put in at the National Archives, and there have been very, very few reclassifications. In fact, I just looked at this number a couple of days ago, and I think within the last year or two, there may have been 0. In the year before that, there were a couple of pages or a couple of documents. There's a big, serious question when you're talking about reclassifying. What was the reason that the thing was mistakenly classified? Is it already publicly known? And is there actually going to be harm that requires reclassification? Because reclassifying itself can lead to harm. And these are questions which I do believe that the National Archives, in response to the scandal, has been much more professional in handling.
I know that in 2006 there was a report published, and I don't know who that was by, that said there were 55,000 pages. So if there were 55,000 pages reclassified, and you're saying there was none in the last 2 years,
Right,
they must be doing a better job of it.
That report was in response to the fact that that we had uncovered this massive reclassification effort, and that is indeed what the Information Security Oversight
Do you know
Office
how many
did.
of those 55,000 pages were then
made available?
unclassified?
I don't know whether
Okay.
they were then unclassified.
That's fine.
If I may, I think it's important to note, too, that it was not NARA that declassified these materials. NARA cannot declassify other agencies' documents. They were materials that were, that various agencies, the CIA and other agencies, had interest in, and one of them had declassified it, and other agencies were unhappy when they discovered that, CIA was unhappy, for instance, when they discovered the State Department might have declassified something that they didn't want. But these were in NARA's safekeeping, and it happened on NARA's property, but it was not NARA that declassified the information inappropriately or not.
And I think that's a good point, Ms. McDermott. I guess the rush to declassify, maybe that process needs to be slowed down, that each one of the agencies have an opportunity to look at it before it is put into the unclassified.
If I could just comment on that briefly, I think you're absolutely correct that there needs to be a much better process for declassifying, but I don't think that means that we should stop declassifying. What I think that means is we should pursue something that NARA has, in fact, initiated, but on a much larger scale, which is a National Declassification Center, where every agency would be there and every agency would play a role, and so we could make sure that we are not spending taxpayer money protecting old secrets that are no longer important, and instead we're actually protecting things that are really sensitive today.
Okay, I'm gonna have to make the question shorter. We'll have to make the answer shorter. But the National Security Archive, they rely heavily on the Freedom of Information Act to acquire materials. How long do you think is or how would you evaluate agencies' responsiveness to the Freedom of Information Act request for the National Security Archive to get this information?
I would say we see a wide range of practice at agencies. Some agencies are far more professional. When material is classified, it causes a delay in the review and the release of information. We have seen some improvements in the last couple of years in terms of customer service at agencies, but we have not seen significant improvements in terms of the speed with which records, or with which they're responding to FOIA requests that we have filed.
Average time, would you say, if you're asking for something to go through the process to see if it's classified, non-classified, or whatever? What you know,
Certainly,
2 years,
if it
3
was-
months, 4 days?
Nothing that we request has ever been provided in 4 days. Although I would say that if it's classified, we would be looking at several months to several years, and at some agencies, many years.
Can I just have one little follow-up, and I won't have a second round? And this is for Ms. Futch, too. As you know, that I guess in January, there was a report, or the Pentagon said there was a report about the detainees in Guantanamo Bay. In the fact that of the 534 prisoners, about 1 out of 7 had been either gone back into militant activity or with the Taliban or whatever, and that they were going to release, they said in January they were going to release it. Well, as you may know, as of today, they have not released it, but yet the New York Times reported on the story of the Pentagon and actually gave the exact numbers of the ones that had returned to flight. And if you had requested a report from the Pentagon under the Freedom of Information Act, and Pentagon officials promised to release it promptly, would you be upset that the Pentagon dragged its feet on what you had asked and then leaked it to the New York Times?
Well, that's a good question. I think that the Freedom of Information Act is not always administered as professionally as I'd like. It is the appropriate way for members of the public, like my organization, to ask for information from government agencies. I can't really speak to the leak because I don't know who leaked it, but I certainly think that there is a process that should be followed when folks like us ask, and in this instance, I gather maybe it wasn't.
Well, it sounds like to me, though, that they, I guess the Freedom of Information Act that they submitted counted more than, getting the information to the public as was promised in January. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Balance my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Westmoreland. Thanks for those questions, too. A panel-wide question. What are some of the deficiencies in the presidential library system that you believe must be addressed by the next archivist? Let's start with Mr. White.
Well, it's funny you should ask, because about a week ago, or 2 weeks ago, we submitted, as you know, Congress asked the National Archives to prepare a report to you that's due this summer detailing alternative models for the presidential library system. And I have our comments, if I could submit them for the record later on.
Without objection.
One of the issues I hate to point out is with Congress. Funding is always an issue with everything, but as we've seen with some of the presidential libraries, the FDR library, for example, had horrible conditions. The roof was leaking and everything else. We constantly see appropriators adding earmarks for particular presidential libraries that have more, how should we say, politically powerful people behind them. So
More popularity.
more popularity.
Okay.
There's not one. It's not the Harry Truman Library, by the way. I mean, probably the biggest issue, or without belaboring the point, is declassification, and it affects. It's endemic. It affects everything that the archives, almost everything that the archives does. Without dealing with declassification, you're going to have these backlogs. I believe when Tom Blanton, who's the executive director of Meredith's organization, testified a few years ago before you, there was a 5-year backlog? Now it's a 7-year backlog at the Reagan Library if you put in a request for information. Now, if you're a historian or a grad student, even worse, and you're working on your dissertation, you can't wait 7 years to get the documents that you may need, critical documents that you need for your dissertation. So, I mean, from a historian's point of view, this is an absolute nightmare, these backlogs. Again, I'll make another pitch for the National Declassification Center that was in the report of the Public Interest Declassification Board. If you put declassification in one place with agency representatives who have expertise in declassification for the CIA, Homeland Security, whatever, if they're all in one place, it can speed things up. So if you asked me to name one, I would say declassification was probably the biggest one.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I'll just quickly sort of jump on that. You know, it's not just the historians. It's also sometimes we have fairly current need for information that presidential libraries have. For example, the nomination of a Supreme Court justice who may have worked in an administration previously. People want to see those records. Or someone who's running for office to be president of the United States, and people want to see those records because they exist. And the presidential libraries, I mean, particular presidential libraries, because such a huge quantity of materials being sent to them, they're just not really, they don't have the capacity, frankly, to get through it all and get it out in any reasonable amount of time. So, I mean, we think that NARA should be allowed to really focus on the records and getting the records out, and that they should be looking towards new ways of making things available, including much more online availability, so they don't need as much physical facilities.
And can I add one thing, Mr. Chairman? I went to the budget hearing for NARA the other day before the Appropriations Committee. They have taken in 100 terabytes of electronic records from the Bush administration. In the Clinton administration, they took in 2 terabytes. Now, you heard Mr. McHenry talk about a terabyte is millions and millions of pages, so you can see how exponentially the electronic records are growing, so it makes another need for why we need to get the electronic records archive system up and running as well.
I read that 1 terabyte was equivalent to 1 million books. Now, you know, with the revelation of a security breach, even with some of the things that Mr. McHenry said in his opening statement, do we have a cultural problem at Archive? Have they advanced with the technology that we are now faced with in the 21st century? Have they kept up with that? Are they prepared to even receive the records of this current administration once that ends, as far as being able to catalog it and to store it and to be the purveyor of those records? Are they prepared for that? Does a new director have to come in and change an entire culture of an agency?
I think that the Archives has already learned. They called for a number of years for a liaison at the White House General Counsel's office, somebody dedicated to dealing with them on presidential records. And from what I understand, the Obama White House has assigned 2 people to that task, to liaison with NARA. So dealing with the issues while they're being created will make it much easier in 4 or 8 years when President Obama leaves office. So dealing with things up front makes things much easier on the back end.
McDermott?
Yeah, I think that the archives itself, my impression, and again, this is from outside, is that it's sort of the cobbler's children. that and again, this is from conversations, that their own record keeping, electronic record keeping, may not be terrific, that when people are leaving their offices, they delete their email. And of course, the ERA is under development, although, as you know from GAO reports and your own committee work, that there are problems with that. So I think there are potentially technology issues within NARA in terms of its own ability to manage its own records, much less to manage all of the rest of the records. And then, there's a leadership issue in terms of the rest of the government. They do have that responsibility. They don't really want to take it, but they do have that throughout the government, and they have to provide leadership in moving the executive branch towards electronic records management, and that is a big technological challenge and a cost.
Thank you for that response.
I'm happy to add my voice, and I'll be very quick. I do think there's a need for cultural change. I think that NARA has not had cooperation from the executive branch, and so there needs to be pressure put on each agency as well, that they should be responsible. They need congressional backup, and in some instances, they need some more authority from Congress so that they can actually let the agencies know more. They can be more vocal, perhaps, about the problems. I think that they need a leader who can manage, and they need a leader who can lead. And that may mean they need more than one person. So I would sort of support the comment Ms. McDermott said, that there should be another political appointee position. And I urge you, when you do have NARA here, to ask them, what are they going to do when they get the things from the White House wiki at the end of this administration? Do they have any idea how to manage those kinds of records? Because that's a whole new level of complexity that I don't think we even had in the Bush administration, that we clearly are going to have in the Obama administration.
Thank you so much. Mr. Westmoreland, you can recognize.
Thank you. And President Obama announced this morning that the administration will review the classification policies at every agency. And so from what we just talked about and hearing what Mr. White said, do you think the appropriate evaluator of these Freedom of Information requests would be the OGIS or the agency that was in possession of the requested material? And each one of you can answer.
Right. I think in the first instance, we think that the one who should be evaluating the classification is the agency that classified it. I don't think that we have any problem with that. I think when we talk about the National Declassification Center and historical records, we do think that the authority of one agency to block declassification is a concern, because we've seen that agencies will, simply put up roadblocks even when they can't convince another agency. Then you wonder why it should be classified. So I think those are two different categories.
And if they got confused, it could clog up the whole system. Is that not?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, the president has ultimate authority about whether something should be classified or not. And the president certainly has the ability to declassify records if he chooses to do so.
I think it's also useful to note that when there's a request for a classified piece of information and an agency turns it down, an individual or the requester has a choice to go to court, or they can go through a process that's a mandatory declassification review, and then there's an appeals process beyond that where people from outside of the originating agency have a chance to look at the document and make some decisions about whether all or portions of it could be declassified and released. And, that's more or less effective. But there are processes in place that it doesn't, for contemporaneous declassification as opposed to after the 25 years or that sort of thing. There are processes that have been put in place and that are overseen by the Information Security Oversight Office that seem to work reasonably well, although they have a tremendous backlog now too, and everybody needs more resources. So,
Mr. White.
And I hate to go back to always saying it helps on the front end, but President Bush issued, I don't know what it was, a policy called Controlled Unclassified Information, where he wanted to reduce, there's something like 100 different ways things can be classified as sensitive. He reduced that to 3. But we're still waiting for, and then he sent out, President sent out a recommendation from different agencies as to how to implement this new policy. It still hasn't been implemented. We're waiting for the Obama administration to issue this new policy, and I think that hopefully having it so that things fall into 3 different stovepipes instead of 100 different stovepipes where you have to determine if one agency says this is top secret, it might not mean what top secret means at another agency. Hopefully down the road will help the process.
Do you think the OGIS should be the facilitator or the link between those people to where, you know, the CIA may say this is classified and the State Department says it's not?
Well, I think that that's somewhat what their role was envisioned as being the final arbiter of you know, what goes and what doesn't go. But Meredith would know.
I would disagree. I mean, they're a mediator, and so what they will be doing is they will be trying to get the agency and the FOIA requester to reach some sort of agreement. And I think the reason that our community felt it was important to have this office was that we found that agencies were obstructing requests for information for poor reasons, not for legitimate reasons, and the only alternative you had was to go to court. Now, my organization, we're happy to go to court. I'm a lawyer, I can litigate, but you know what? Your average guy in the street really doesn't have the ability to go to court, and it's not right that they should have to go to court to find out something from their government.
Okay, and one last question. You know, somebody said that the president, you know, set the policy for the declassification of all these things. And I guess he's the final person to decide if it's declassified or not. And he made he announced this morning he was going to review all these classification policies at every agency. But from what I'm hearing from you, he could make a policy that would automatically set the policy for all the agencies. And do you suggest that the president do that rather than going through trying to analyze all these classification policies of the different agencies, or just say, okay, this is going to be the policy?
Right. I mean, I think there's 2 things going on. I think every president has issued an executive order dealing with classification policy. And indeed, President Bush's executive order was in many ways very similar to President Clinton's, and President Clinton's had an innovation that has been retained that I presume President Obama will retain, that will declassify the historic records. So that we should assume that President Obama will appropriately issue a broad memo. The other thing that I believe he talked about today, although I don't know the details, is that each agency has to have a review of its own policies, because some agencies do a far better job than other agencies. And that goes with respect to classifying, also with respect to protecting classified, and also with respect to declassifying. Some agencies have things built into their system to prevent overclassification. And you know, people think, why does overclassification matter? Overclassification matters because people lose respect for the system when everything is classified. That's why there's so many leaks, because people don't feel that the things that are protected must be protected. In addition, it costs money, and it obviously prevents the public from getting information. So each agency does need a review of their own policies.
Well, we just don't want it to be political, you know, because, and just one final comment, and then I'll quit, but we don't want it to be political about what's declassified and what's not, because there's a lot of things going on around Washington right now that's he says, she says kind of deals, and you know, so if we're going to open it up, let's do it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Watson, you recognize for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. I understand that NYRA has entered into a $317 million contract with Lockheed Martin to develop a comprehensive management system for electronic records. And do any of you have reason to believe that a system like that would be capable of adequately processing the massive amount of records in the system? And do you know of any existing program for record management that the NYRA could adapt to function on the scale they need? Would you have that information? Dr. Battle is not here.
I think that I don't personally. I mean, I know what GAO has said. and the other reports that have come out. But no, I think there do seem to be some questions about the capacity, the capability of the electronic records archive. But I think that's probably a subject for a hearing with parties who are directly
I'm sure
involved.
this committee will be following up with Dr. Battle so we can get the direct information.
Good,
But
good.
any of the other witnesses have?
I agree. Can't recommend an alternative system, although a lot of money's been spent already on the electronic records archive. So hopefully, rather than scrapping it, it can be made to work and work quickly. I believe that they are, you'd have to talk to NARA, but that they believe that it will work. And I guess I just would add, from our perspective, that there's other things NARA can do before the records even get to them to try to make things be in, the sort of proper order and proper formats to make it easier for them to ingest, so they don't have to do things like buy proprietary software, so that they can hold things before they go into the electronic record archive. Things like that they could be doing. But again, I agree with Ms. McDermott.
Well,
They would
let
have
me
to.
throw this out. I've been listening to the three of you, and you talk about the time it takes. If we're going to declassify information, what are the steps, what are the procedures that you have to go through? Why would it take years? Can anyone comment on, why is the process so lengthy?
Well, I think
I
that's
know resources weren't there.
Right, well, that's a good question, and I ask it regularly myself, and every time I have the opportunity to talk to people at NARA, I try to find out more about the steps. I mean, I think some of it is, you mentioned the 400 million pages that have been declassified that are waiting to get out to the public. Once it's been declassified, that's just one part of the analysis. So at least for the historical records, they still then have to review them for privacy concerns, and there's other processing steps. My hope is that having a national declassification and records center would facilitate some of that. I mean, certainly part of the problem with the classified records is the referrals to every agency. So a record, the Navy might say it's okay to be declassified, but they need the CIA to sign off on that, and they need the State Department to sign off on that. And what do? They sort of send it from agency to agency, or it sits waiting until someone from that agency comes to take a look at it. A National Declassification Center would bring all those people to the table, and they would have to agree to cooperate. And I think that would save a lot of time and a lot of money if they approached it that way.
And one of the other challenges of the electronic records archive is searchability. I mean, if I want to do a biography,
Can you bring the mic closer up?
I'm sorry. Is one of the issues is searchability. When the electronic records archive is up and running, if I want to write a biography of Chairman Clay and I go in and type Clay, I'm going to get, a zillion records. I mean, how efficient will the system be so that it's searchable and user friendly? I mean, that'll be a big challenge for the system.
Well, I think the technology exists. If we can put a telescope greater than the Hubble, that has to travel millions of miles, I think we can do that. And I heard time and time again that the resources were not there, whatever that means. We know it means dollars and people with expertise.
But it also means
right.
Expertise.
But I think what I'm hearing, you're not saying it, but I'm gathering, a lot of it's political.
No, if I would say that it's political, I think if there is a problem with the electronic records archive, I think it really has to do with NARA's internal capability to oversee somebody like Lockheed Martin and an enormous contract of that nature. I think in terms of access to presidential records, I think maybe there are sometimes political decisions being made, but I think mostly NARA has a very professional staff, very committed to making the record open. So I don't think that for the most part it's politics in the way we normally understand it. Now, leaking of classified information, that's political.
And the other,
I just want to mention, it might be small p political. It may not be, political, which party wants something to happen, but it may be agencies jockeying for position and not willing to cooperate and not willing to do what they ought to be doing, and NARA not being in a position to push them the right way.
and all I would add is anytime any government agency buys a new computer system of any size, I just read an article the other day about the Copyright Office has this huge backlog at the Copyright Office because they put in a new system and people can't get their copyrights because it's so backlogged. So I'm not to excuse NARA, but I think it's sort of happens routinely when the government is procuring big information systems.
Yeah, when we then created Homeland Security, an agency that took in 750 different agencies underneath, and I thought, oh my goodness, people come, they have budget conflicts and procedural and steps and so on that are unique to, I thought, how are we going to manage this? And right now, the reality after it's been created is that we need to pull some of the agencies out, such as FEMA, but that has nothing to do with this. But, I'm thinking the magnitude of it. And is there anything out there that can serve as a model of how we would be able to expedite? Do you know of anything?
I don't offhand. I think the only place to look would be to some of the big corporations.
Can you pull that
I'm
mic?
sorry, yes. It's possible that at some of the very big law firms that are sort of nationwide and have national offices all over, or some very big corporations, they're facing many of the same challenges that the government has in terms of managing records. Now, ingesting massive volumes of electronic data is really probably something that is, if not totally unique, essentially unique to the National Archives, in that every 4 or 8 years they get this massive influx of information which they have to process and make available. So there may be some models for records management, but in terms of this, I really don't know that there would be anything. I don't know, no other agency really faces this kind of problem.
I guess I would add that's one of the reasons that we've advocated that NARA's concerns need to be addressed at the beginning of the records, at the records creation, as opposed to waiting until the other end, because it makes much more sense to build into the information technology that all the agencies are putting in place the long-term preservation concerns. I think in the long run that would save money for the taxpayers and would certainly make it easier, I think, for NARA if things came in, in the format that's easiest for them to deal with. So I think that would be that's something my organization has stated a fair bit, that we think that it should be built into all sorts of IT funding, the long-term life cycle of the record, including ultimate access.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Watson. Let me ask you, NARA officials have developed a detailed 10-year strategic plan. Some of you note deficiencies in the plan. What must the next archivist do to make the plan operational and effective? We'll start with you, Ms. Fuchs. Who wants to start?
I'm going to...
Okay.
I'm sorry, the plan does address the kinds of things that NARA should be addressing. But what I would do is for every strategic goal, I would make it into an action item. And I feel like that's the main deficiency of the plan, is that most of the strategic goals are stated in my view, passive terms, and that the next archivist should actually view their job as much more of an active position.
And actually have benchmarks.
Well, and they do have
achieve them.
performance plans that they also post, but I don't know if you've read them, but they're not terribly informative. I think I agree with Meredith that the strategies are fairly passive, and for records management, for instance, they say we'll expand the demand for records management in the federal government. There's no explanation of what that means. By advocating for access to it at senior levels, advocating for electronic records management is not the same as providing leadership and direction and clear policies. And so I think that they need more concrete steps about what specifically they are going to do, not these vague statements that most agency strategic plans are, that's the language. It's vague and it's aspirational, but it's not concrete. And so I think the next archivist, and if there's a second-tier political appointee, really needs to take the agency through a serious thinking of how they're going to move not only the agency, but the federal government, the executive branch, forward.
And I would just say that I think the archivist needs to be an agent of change, and I think we discussed changing the organizational culture. The archivist needs to be, I think, more aggressive in making sure benchmarks are met. Not only that, and number two, working with you up here and with the GAO on oversight. Oversight, in the end, is what makes the train go, and having an archivist in there that's dedicated to aggressively meeting the strategic plan is very important.
Thank you all for your testimony today. If there are no further questions, I move that the subcommittee adjourn. And the question is on the motion to adjourn. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is adopted, and the subcommittee stands adjourned. Thank you.